Hey guys, the Australian Open is underway and I saw a very interesting stat. The 3 fastest forehands of the tournament so far. And it's not to my surprise that Joao Fonseca is at number 1. He hit a forehand 181 kilometers per hour. Even prior to the Australian Open starting, he was still playing a challenger in Canberra. I started researching his forehand, and to me, it's one of the best forehands that I've seen in a long time. I compared his rhythm to Del Potro's rhythm. Of course, the forehands are very different between Del Potro and Fonseca, different style, but the footwork rhythm is similar. And Fonseca, in his win against Rublev, was displaying some of that amazing rhythm. When Rublev was giving him a little bit of time, the way Fonseca was setting up, it almost looks like a dance, that hop into the load very late in the forehand swing when the racket is already in the drop. Makes the forehand look so rhythmic and stylistically very pleasing to look at. But it's not only that, he's got the whole package. He's got a phenomenal backhand as well. I analyzed this backhand a few days ago. It reminds me a little bit of David Nalbandian. I analyzed Fonseca's serve as well. I don't foresee him to be the best server in the world, but he's got a good serve. His rhythm is a tad unorthodox because he loads very late into the motion, and that requires a higher toss, which, by the way, is not a problem at all. I'm going to make a separate video about high toss versus low toss. But in any case, his forehand backhand combination is on par with Sinner and Djokovic, in my opinion. Now back to the forehand stats. At number 2, we had Giovanni Mepecci Perricard hitting a forehand at 180 kilometers an hour. And coming in at number 3 is Carlos Alcaraz hitting a forehand at 178 kilometers per hour. And you know what is super interesting about the top 3 fastest forehands at the Australian Open? They all have different arm structures. So the 3rd place forehand, Carlos Alcaraz, is completely straight at the moment of contact. The 2nd place forehand, Perricard, is extremely bent at the moment of contact. Some people call this a chicken wing forehand or a T-Rex forehand. I happen to hit my forehand like this as well, and I've heard these comments thousands of times, how ugly my forehand is and so on. I've made videos about this subject. But in any case, Perricard hits with a very bent elbow at the moment of contact, and Fonseca is not straight, he's not extremely bent, he's somewhere in the middle. He is slightly bent at the moment of contact. So what conclusions can we make from this data? Is the bent arm forehand faster than a straight arm forehand? After all, isn't Carlos Alcaraz at number 3? But then you start thinking of some of the best forehands in tennis history. Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, those are extremely high on my list on the best forehands of all time, and they hit the forehand straight. Here's the thing. You cannot make an argument that one forehand is better than the other. All these forehands are great, and if you look at those speeds, they're very close together. So you can create an unbelievable amount of power with a bent arm forehand, even if it's severely bent like Perricard, and you can also create an incredible amount of power with a straight arm forehand. This is not a fundamental element of the forehand. This is a stylistic element, because if you compare these 3 forehands, despite different stylistic elements, they all possess the fundamentals. So they all load the forehand properly. They all have a rhythm where they start opening up slightly prior to the racket going forward. They're making contact in front and they're finishing their forehands, and they're using their body to accommodate the swing path so that the arm doesn't have to work overtime. When Roger Federer came on the scene, shortly followed by Rafael Nadal, and people started seeing that both guys were straight at the moment of contact. And coaches started to teach this to everyone as the most optimal way to strike a forehand. And around that time, I also started seeing some very negative statements about the WTA forehand. The WTA forehand is almost an insult. You tell somebody, hey, you have a WTA forehand, that's supposed to be something really bad. But I don't see it that way. Why? Because players on the WTA tour have amazing forehands. My 2 favorites are Sloane Stephens and Iga Swiatek. And if you look at a still shot of Iga Swiatek at the moment of contact, you're going to see this, very similar to Perricard. If you take a look at a still shot of Sloane Stephens at the moment of contact, it's going to look very similar. T-Rex, chicken wing, whatever you want to call it. However, if you look at those two forehands in real time, they look absolutely beautiful. If you take a look at that still shot, it's going to look ugly because the arm is severely bent and it looks cramped. The actual contact with the ball takes place in milliseconds. You cannot see the contact. So you don't see that Iga is like this at the moment of contact because that part of the forehand is over in milliseconds. What do you see? You see the prep, you see the racket dropping, and you see the finish, parts of the forehands that are taking place slower. The fast portion of the forehand, the forward approach, the contact, and shortly thereafter, you don't really see it because players are accelerating extremely fast. So having said that, when we're talking about the moment of contact, anything that takes place in this part of the stroke is an intuitive process because that part of the stroke is taking place in milliseconds. So back to the Federer and Nadal forehand in the mid-2000s. So many young players were taught to extend the arm fully on the forehand and maintain this extension into the contact and shortly thereafter, and then bring the arm back into a bend. Back in those days, I was coaching a lot of high-level juniors who have received this instruction. And these players were trying really hard to extend their arm, and they were successfully doing so by killing their continuity on the forehand in order to extend the arm. But the interesting thing was that despite these players extending their arm on the racket drop, they were still going into a bend at the moment of contact. So here's the important lesson. You might be trying to adapt a straight arm forehand, or maybe you are trying to adapt a bent arm forehand. You should do none of that. You should learn the fundamentals of the forehand. And I've made many videos on what those are. And fact is that your arm structure at the moment of contact or on the racket drop is a stylistic element on the forehand, and it is absolutely not a fundamental element. If it was a fundamental element, the top 3 forehands during the Australian Open would have a similar arm structure. And based on what I showed you today, they don't. They have 3 different arm structures, and yet these 3 players have incredible forehands. So don't worry whether your arm is straight or bend. What's important is that you make contact at the right place. What's important that you have rotation on the forehand. I made a video 5 years ago telling you what the most common errors are at the recreational level, and one of those was the fact that players make contact too far back. Their dominant shoulder is behind. When you take a look at the pro level, in 90% of the cases you're going to see the dominant shoulder in front. And still at the recreational level, all these years later, this video did quite well, but I'm going to keep emphasizing that you have to make sure that you rotate properly on your forehand, that you sequence your rotation properly so that you can make contact in front. And when you are able to do that, your arm structure is 100% irrelevant. You shouldn't even think about it. And here's the funny thing. A lot of players are not even aware what their arm structure is at the moment of contact. Why? Because the contact is over in milliseconds. So any attempt to manipulate your arm and make it straighter will result in a forehand that's less continuous, because you will have to be conscious of how your racket is dropping. You will have to make this part slower or interrupt this part right here, which will kill your continuity and your acceleration. And not only that, you also are going to have to make sure that the arm is completely straight at the moment of contact. And that right here is an absolute forehand destroyer. You don't want to slow down your forehand right at the moment of contact. You're going to absolutely destroy the continuity of your forehand, the feel of your forehand, and most importantly, the acceleration of your forehand, because what you want to achieve is this feeling of being able to hit the ball freely. And again, if you try to manipulate your arm structure, you're simply not going to be able to do that. So long story short, do not worry about the arm structure. Do not try to hit your forehand like Fonseca and be bent. Don't try to hit your forehand like Perricard, and don't try to hit your forehand like Alcaraz. Take a look at the things that these 3 guys have in common and try to copy that. And those are going to be the forehand fundamentals.